Hello. Welcome back to Happy Nightmares. If you recall, Mark, under the spell of an unknown force, is walking through the city leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. How will this end? We find out now in part 2 of Watch the Child.
Part 7. Suzan. Suzan walked along behind her neighbor, keeping her distance. With no success in getting his attention, she deduced that he was a sleepwalker. She decided to follow him, and when he became aware of his surroundings once again, she would be there to explain what had happened, so that he wasn't completely caught off guard. The idea of being able to help her new neighbor made her feel good, and she even walked with a little skip in her step. After all, she was out in the sunlight getting some exercise. The skip in her step stopped when she realized that they were coming to the edge of their addition, and a very busy street. And Mr. McAfee wasn't stopping. "Mr. McAfee, stop!" she yelled, knowing that she would get no response. A look of horror bloomed on her face, and she screamed as she watched the man walk straight into oncoming traffic. She started running after him, but stopped as a large pickup truck honked loudly and swerved out of the way to avoid hitting her neighbor. The truck missed her also, and she had to lean against a telephone pole to catch her breath from the close call. As she took deep breaths, she heard a blaring car horn and looked up just in time to see a gray sedan headed straight for her. She pushed away from the telephone pole and ran as the car slammed into the pole, missing her by inches. Suzan ran through the wake of the chaos that followed Mr. McAfee, struggling to catch up. There were several people walking after him now, yelling at him and screaming profanities. She fought her way through the people until she was right next to the man and began waving her arms and yelling his name. "Mr. McAfee, wake up!" she yelled. But it was no use. He just kept walking. His eyes were droopy, and the look on his face was one of serenity. The man was happy, blissfully ignorant of everything happening around him. When getting his attention didn't work, Suzan decided that she would continue along with him and try to explain to the people what was going on. Just then, someone ran up from behind and pushed Mr. McAfee to the ground. "Stop that!" Suzan yelled. Mr. McAfee put one hand out in front of him, and Suzan reached down to help him up. His hand was ice cold as she pulled him to his feet, and without a thank you or acknowledgement of any kind, he continued to walk. Suzan tried to explain to the angry mob, which had now grown exponentially, that the man was sleepwalking, that he didn't know what he was doing, but they wouldn't listen. He was pushed down a couple more times, and each time Suzan would help him back to his feet. Then she began to stand in the way when someone would rush him. "Don't you dare," she would say, or "Get back!" Eventually, the people stopped rushing at him and decided they would wait until the man turned and addressed them to take their revenge. He had to wake up eventually. Suzan took her mind off the mob for a moment in time to realize that they were coming to another busy intersection. She was walking backward and looking around at the new dilemma when she stepped into a divot in the ground and went down hard. Mr. McAfee walked out into the intersection, and his path angled to the right, taking him toward a new median. Tires squealed and screeched around them. It was amazing that he had not been killed yet. It was as if something was making sure he stayed alive. Some of the cars that swerved out of the way made much sharper turns than seemed realistic. A few more joined the mob of angry citizens out for blood. Suzan struggled to her feet and had to fight her way back through the group to get to her neighbor. They were now on Hillshire Road, another 6-lane street, and headed for an overpass. Suddenly, Mr. McAfee took a sharp turn to the left, heading once again into oncoming traffic. This time, Suzan ran out ahead of him and put up her hands, praying that the cars would stop in time. They did, after laying some fresh rubber on the street, and she kept the path clear as Mr. McAfee made his way across the street. Once on the other side, Suzan motioned for the cars to go, and the path was closed off, sealing the angry mob on the median. She figured they would find a way to catch up, but for now, she could try to get her neighbor's attention in peace. The two of them continued through the grass on the side of the road, making slow progress toward the overpass. Part 8. Mark. Mark blinked once, and the little girl was gone. The voices in his head never stopped, and he only had to search a moment before he spotted the girl at the top of the grassy hill leading to the street above on the overpass. "Hey," he mumbled drowsily. "Don't go so fast." It was at this moment that he first noticed the woman that was following him. He turned and looked at her with his half-closed eyes. Mark's vision blurred, and a piercing scream filled his head. His hands clutched his ears, nearly ripping them from the sides of his head. He begged for the sound to stop. He turned his head back to the little girl, and the sound faded. She waved for him to follow and began skipping out onto the overpass. "Wait," he called out again, just slightly louder than his last near whisper. "Wait for me." Mark took off running, clawing his way up the steep grassy hill to the top of the overpass. He had forgotten the blurry woman at the bottom of the hill, and once again the poem filled his head as dirt and grass buried themselves beneath his fingernails. The sunlight warms and sets the day on fire, sets the day on fire. Panic filled him as he struggled to catch up to the girl. He could not see her. He had to be able to see her. A series of slurred grunts and yells came from between his clenched teeth, but nothing that could be called a word or a sentence. Finally, he reached the top of the hill, breathing heavily and looking frantically from side to side in search of the little girl. He found her, halfway across the overpass, standing on the railing, one step away from a 30-foot drop. Part 9. Suzan. As they walked, Suzan became more worried about the situation. When was this going to end? Surely a sleepwalker doesn't go on for this long. As they grew close to the overpass, Mr. McAfee stopped. She hoped, just for a moment, that maybe he was snapping out of whatever trance he was in. Her neighbor looked around as if something was suddenly missing. He looked up at the overpass and then suddenly turned and looked directly at Suzan with his slack eyes. Almost instantly, the man buckled to his knees and began grabbing at his ears and screaming. She wanted to kneel down with him, to hold him, to try to help in some way, but it ended almost as soon as it began. Then he climbed back to his feet and stared once again at the overpass. Then he spoke. "Hey," he said, "wait for me." Who was he talking to? His words were meant to be yelled. She could tell by the apparent effort he was attempting to put behind them, but they were so quiet, as if he had no strength in his lungs. Before she knew what was happening, her neighbor had taken off, scrambling up the grassy hill toward the top of the overpass. Suzan tried to keep up, but the distance had already been put between them. She was much older than Mr. McAfee, and the hill was very steep. When he finally stood at the top of the hill, Suzan heard Mr. McAfee say something else, slightly louder this time, but couldn't make out the words. Then he started walking onto the overpass. Part 10. Chris. Chris was getting anxious. He had gotten out of his car and was now standing beside it in the sun, which had grown quite a bit warmer. Craning his neck as he tried to evaluate what, if any, progress had been made. Then, horns began to honk, followed by clapping and cheering. The intersection was clear. Chris got back into his car, buckled his seatbelt, then he turned up his music a little louder and put the car in drive. Part 11. Mark. Mark walked along the edge of the overpass toward the girl standing on the railing. "Not safe," he said. "Of course it's safe," the little girl replied cheerfully. "Look." The girl stepped off the railing, but she did not fall. Instead, she took 3 large steps out onto nothing and spun around, her dress twirling carelessly. "See?" she said with a wide grin on her face. A smile appeared on Mark's face as well. Slowly and carefully, he began to climb the railing. Part 12. Suzan. When Suzan finally reached the top of the hill, she was so out of breath that she could barely stand. The pain in her side was abundant, and for a moment she knelt on the ground, clutching her ribs. She heard another mumble of words from down the overpass, and when she looked over, she saw Mr. McAfee climbing the concrete barrier topped with a full metal guardrail along the edge of the overpass. "Oh my," she said. "Mr. McAfee, no!" Despite the pain in her side, she stood up and began to run. "Stop! Please stop!" she yelled. But her neighbor continued to climb until he was standing on the very top rail, swaying in the wind. Part 13. Chris. After 2 or 3 rotations of the streetlight, Chris finally got through the intersection and was once again on his way to work. "What a nightmare," he said to himself, content with no longer sitting stagnant. As he drove down toward the overpass, he noticed a large mob of people moving down the side of the road. "Some kind of rally or something?" he said as he passed them. None of them looked too happy. He shrugged and continued on. Looking up, Chris saw cars driving past and a man walking across the overpass. Dismissing these as standard sights one might experience on the morning commute, Chris paid them no mind. He did not see the man begin to climb the railing, and he did not see the woman running frantically across the overpass after him. Part 14. Suzan. Suzan ran as fast as she could, but Mr. McAfee was now standing on the top railing. She was still a good ways away, and if he jumped now, she would never reach him. She continuously screamed his name with no success. The pain in her side was unbearable and suddenly flared up so fiercely that she collapsed to the ground, skinning her knees on the rocky shoulder of the road. Curled up on the side of the street, she twisted her neck toward the man that she had spent the last hour protecting, just in time to see him step off the railing and begin to fall. Part 15. Chris. Chris turned up his music even louder. Having escaped the traffic jam, his spirits were rising and his favorite song had just come on the radio. He sang along, loud enough for someone driving along next to him to hear, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel without a care in the world. When he turned his head to see if anyone actually was there, he was shocked to see a young woman driving a sports car. He was not shocked because she was there, but because she was looking at him with an expression of pure terror. She was mouthing silent words to him. She appeared to be screaming, and she was pointing up. Up at what? It was too late. Just as Chris's car reached the overpass, a body crashed through the windshield, knocking Chris unconscious. The steering wheel failed to control itself, and the car was sent into a violent action movie tumble. Part 16. Mark. Standing on the railing, Mark looked down. It was a long drop. He looked up again at the little girl standing about 5 feet away from him. She was not standing on anything, and yet she hovered safely in the air. She walks toward beauty. The children sang louder than ever in his mind, and thoughts of walking on air swelled inside him. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and followed the child away from the railing. The voices stopped, and the roaring sound of traffic filled his ears. He opened his eyes, and the girl was not there. Mark McAfee began to fall 30 feet to the busy street below. Terror froze him as he wondered how he had gotten where he was. He could not scream. He could not move. He simply fell, rigid, through the air. There was no time for realization, no time to brace himself. He was still wondering what happened when a car drove directly underneath him and his body crumpled into its windshield. There was one split second of unbelievable pain and fear, and then only darkness. The car spun, and the tires caught on the pavement, sending it into a sideways tumble. As the car rolled violently down the highway, spraying dangerous debris and shrapnel in every direction, Mark's body was thrown wide and cracked to the pavement with sickening hostility. The car twisted and turned down Hillshire Road before coming to rest in a ditch about 40 yards past Mark McAfee's broken body. Part 17. Suzan. Suzan stood with a police officer. Tears streamed down her face. She was doing her best to explain what happened, but so much of it seemed unlike reality to her that it was difficult. She watched as the paramedics wheeled the man who had been driving the car into the back of the ambulance. He did not look good, but at least he was breathing. A cold wind blew through the warm day, and Suzan felt something come in contact with her leg as she shivered. When she looked down, she saw a small piece of paper. It looked old, like thick parchment, and the writing on it was a very elegant script. A smear of fresh blood stained the right edge. "What's that?" the officer asked as Suzan retrieved the paper, and he noticed the blood. "I'm not sure," Suzan replied. In hopes of answering the officer's question, Suzan held up the scrap and began to read what was written. As she did, the sounds of children began to fill the air. She began to feel drowsy, and when she looked up from the paper, she did not see the police officer, but a small girl. She was wearing a pretty little sundress, purple with full white daisies.
The forces of evil are experts at deception. Once you realize what is happening, it is often too late. Take heed, and guard your curiosity the next time something out of the ordinary catches your eye. Thank you for listening. We hope you have enjoyed Watch the Child. Come back soon, and as always, happy nightmares.